So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you guys to Kurt Kohlstedt.
Thanks, Max, and thank you everyone for being here and for having me. It's really an honor. A colleague of mine was here a few years ago, Avery Truckleman, and I really enjoyed her talk. And as Max said, we're going to be talking tonight a little bit about design and context. And by context, I mean everything from a time and a place to the constraints of a design. And as Max said, I think it's something that applies to all forms of design, right? We all have to design in a world that has limitations, but also opportunities that are specific. And so partly I want to tell some stories that help raise awareness about how you can identify design problems around you, and also to talk about how some designs are intrinsically regional, but others can go global too. And with that, unless you have anything else, Max, I will hop right into it. Hi, everyone. I'm Kurt Kohlstedt, and I'm really excited to be here talking with you about design, even if it's only virtually. My background is actually in design. I studied architecture, and I've dabbled in things like graphic, industrial, furniture, residential design, but it turns out that's not really my strength. So for over a decade now, I've been writing and talking professionally about design, and I currently am doing so at 99% Invisible, where we just published a book, The 99% Invisible City, which is all about everyday designs in urban environments. But what I want to talk to you tonight about is designing context. And by that I mean not just times and places, but also the constraints that inform designs more broadly. So I'm going to be drawing from a number of different stories and examples and trying to put them in context for you in a way that makes them relevant to you as designers. So hopefully there are some good design lessons to be learned from these, and hopefully you can apply them in your own designs, and hopefully they're also just interesting stories. And one last technical note, I have pre-recorded these as sort of mini presentations because I'm concerned about the lag that could happen if we try to do it live with me sort of, up in a corner being screenshot while these are going on. So basically, these stories will be a series of mini slideshows, and I'll pop up in between or at the end, and we can talk more and I can answer questions, which I really look forward to. So thanks again for coming. Thanks, Max, for having me. And so the German tilt and turn window is effectively 3 windows in one, and it can serve a variety of functions. Now, when I first encountered these, I was 13 years old, living in Bayreuth, Germany, and I just thought they were kind of magical because I was used to windows that, either swung open or you lifted to open them, but these windows could do all these different things. And to just give you an idea, if you take a traditional, say, fixed window, that'd be your baseline, you can add a swing to that, or you could get a hopper window. But the tilt and turn is all of these things. So it provides some security in the tilted configuration as well as breezes. And when it's a swing window, it can actually be as big as a door and work as a door. So, for example, the backyard of our place was accessed through a tilt and turn door. So it's this giant glass pane door like you see in the image. Now, when I decided to write an article about this and ran it by Roman, I wasn't sure he'd be down. I wasn't sure readers would be down. But it actually drew up a lot of responses. And they kind of broke down into 2 major categories. One was people who were really enthusiastic about the design, either because they already knew about it, had encountered it on their travels, or because they were learning about it for the first time. And then there were a subset of people who were just confounded that anybody would write an article about these things, because to them, these were just windows. This is what a window is. It seems so obvious, right? And one of my takeaways from that is just that, obviously, when you go to a place and you're new, you see things that other people there take for granted. So when you look around you, try to look for things that you consider ordinary and think about ways in which others might consider them extraordinary. Um, and so people had these very strong reactions about the tilt and turn. And there are reasons why the tilt and turn is still regional. For one thing, it costs a lot of money, so that's a factor. And then there are also things about how American modernism evolved to build these kind of hermetically sealed environments in which users weren't supposed to have any control over things like exterior windows. Everything would be done mechanically by HVAC systems, so temperature would just be controlled across the board all through your office tower. That was kind of the approach. So, and then there are some limitations of the tilt and turn too, I must concede. Like putting a window air conditioning unit in one is challenging because you can't lower the window sort of down on top of it to enclose it. So there are reasons why this design has remained somewhat regional. And some of those are cultural, some of those are economic, and some of those are geographical, having to do with climate. I still think that there's a missed opportunity to have more of these in places like the United States. And maybe not every window needs to be a tilt and turn window, but a lot more could be. And I kind of so as these regional design stories were starting to gain traction, we started to get more and more emails about them, including this one from Anton Hagman, who suggested we cover Finnish dish drying cabinets, or in Finnish, Astian Kuivaskapi. That's as close as I'm going to get. It's all one word. But he wrote, quote, being Finnish, there are many designers and designs I can be proud of, especially in architecture and furniture design. But there is one Finnish design that I am more proud of than any other, the dish draining closet. And these things are specialized cupboards that sit over sinks, and the shelves inside have these slots that allow wet dishes to drain. So the design saves time and energy and eliminates the clutter of sink-side dish racks. It's super low tech, but it's also super neat and eco-friendly, and it's been popular in Finland for a long time. In the 1940s, a woman named Maju Gebhard made a prototype for the Finnish Association of Work Efficiency. You can see her here in the picture. And her design was a huge hit. And to Anton, it's this quintessentially Finnish innovation in that it's, quote, practical, unobtrusive, and cheap, end quote. So when he moved abroad, he found himself really missing it. And he lamented to me in an email, quote, now I have to dry my dishes on a rack that sits on the counter like a barbarian, end quote. Once again, fans were really into this. 99PI readers really dug in, and so I put out a call for even more regional design ideas. And sure enough, too, I managed to find at least one supplier of these in the U.S., which was IKEA. I don't know if others have popped up in recent months, but when I last looked, there were very few options. So some industrial designer could really do the world a service and maybe make a good enterprise out of bringing these to the United States. The Japanese Kotatsu Table is something that came to us as a fan suggestion after I had started writing stories about regional designs, and somebody said, I'm in Japan. Have you seen this thing? And it's this piece of furniture that doubles as a heating fixture. And the tables are especially useful in Japan, where houses tend to not be that well insulated. So underneath this Kotatsu table, there is a heating element. And that heating element, basically generates heat that then gets captured by these blankets that spread out from the table. And so the Kotatsu is also particularly effective with certain kinds of traditional Japanese clothing, where the warm air can flow up the kind of big open folds of kimonos and out through the neck and the armholes. So all of this works together as a kind of evolved design system. And it really did evolve, because you can trace the Kotatsu's history all the way back to the 14th century, when they used in-floor cooking stoves. So historically, hot coals in the floor were used as a heating source, first for food and then for, people. And over time, those heating sources became electric and were integrated with tables, and so they moved up, right? And now Kotatsus combine elements of fireplaces, wood stoves, and space heaters, essentially. But unlike most fireplaces that are built into walls, Kotatsus you can literally gather around. And unlike freestanding stoves, they're portable, so you can move them around. And unlike space heaters, they have these cloth layers, right, that can help channel and trap the heat, so it doesn't just dissipate. And I still think that this design has a huge amount of potential in many places. And in fact, there are variations that kind of have cropped up here and there in the Middle East and in North America, but none of them have really taken off like the Kotatsu Table. And maybe it's partly a product of all of these factors that brought it into being. But I still think, for my own home, especially if I'm moved back to a cold place like Minnesota, I would just love to have them. So the Hills Hoist is possibly my favorite of all of these regional contraptions. And it was sent in by another NIMPI fan who has since sent in a number of good ideas. And her name is Alyssa Stevens, and she introduced me to this wonderful contraption, the Hills Rotary Hoist, which is much more than just a rotating clothesline. It's loaded with these cultural associations and has all these creative, unofficial functions. And the device is a quintessential part of the suburban Australian dream. So much so that Alyssa says that a dream house on a quarter-acre lot with a big backyard would be incomplete without one. Now, the hoist was developed by an Australian war veteran in the 1940s. Hill built his first commercial batch from leftover materials, more specifically, old metal tubing that was originally part of a World War II submarine trap located under the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Now, his hoists were a big success in booming post-war suburbia, and even today, the company Hill started sells millions of these things a year. The Hills Hoist is even listed as a national treasure by the National Library of Australia. It has appeared on stamps in museums, and even the logo of an expat rugby team, the Hammersmith Hills Hoists of West London. And as a kid, Alyssa would play a game eating donuts that hung from her family's hoist. The game, as she explains it, was to, quote, hold your hands behind your back and eat as fast as you can. Whoever finishes first wins, although with donuts, everyone wins, right? End quote. And people play all sorts of other games with these things too, as it turns out. Some parents rig up swings for their children on these Hills Hoists. Kids also use them as frameworks for blanket forts. Homeowners will hang decorations on them for birthday parties or weddings or holidays. There's even a drinking game called Goon of Fortune, inspired by Wheel of Fortune, that involves hanging bags of wine on the lines and giving them a spin. And then when the bag comes to a stop, the person it lands in front of has to take a drink. And then owners will sometimes drape these shade structures over the top too. So they become like shade umbrellas during hot summer days down under. So what's really fascinating to me is that it's just sort of this all ages thing, right? Like people, kids, adults, everyone seems to find some useful way to use the Hills Hoist. And there's still new uses being discovered all the time. And that's one of my favorite things about it. And so even after I first published a piece about this, Alyssa and other people who had read it kept sending me stories and pictures. rounding out my understanding of the Hills Hoist and its role in everyday Australian life. And I've learned, among other things, that people suspend chickens from the lines over smoldering fires for backyard cookouts. I've seen kangaroos laying out underneath laundry to enjoy some shade. And then, of course, my personal favorite, some kangaroo rescuers hanging sacks from the lines to house orphaned joeys. And so at the end of the day, what's remarkable here isn't so much the original design intent and function. It's the way people have adapted this sort of versatile design to do a bunch of different things for them. At this point, I've been talking about some of my favorite regional designs, but I wanted to broaden out a bit and do a dive into the book that I've been working on for a few years now and pull out some stories that are potentially relevant to designers. Now, the book itself isn't geared towards designers. It's meant to be an accessible book for everybody, but there are some very designy stories within it that have broader lessons for designers. And so I want to just dive in, pick out a couple of those, and explore the ways in which the lessons they hold can inform your work as a designer. Now, in the book, we talk about a lot of unnoticed designs out in the world. And you, as a designer, might notice more than others, but these ones in particular are pretty small and very common, and they're called slip-based systems. Now, basically how it works is this. There's a lower post that gets put in the ground and an upper post that gets connected to it by breakaway bolts. And these breakaway bolts break away when the upper post is hit. So that reduces damage to the vehicle, and then the vehicle just passes over this lower post, and then after it's all said and done, somebody can come back and install a new sign without, having to put in a new foundation for the post. They can just put it back on top where the broken away post once was. Pretty simple, pretty effective. And there are variants of this too, like this system where you have two posts holding up a single sign. And in this case, there's a hinge involved. So if you have it by the side of the road, you can have the one that's adjacent to the road, the post that's closest to where vehicles are, on a hinge. So the idea here is that it breaks away, but the whole sign doesn't fall down, and the car just passes under the post as it flips up. And the same principle has been applied to some telephone poles too, where they have a breakaway base, and essentially they flip up out of the way, and the wires holding them to adjacent posts temporarily allow them to not fall down completely and fall into the road or fall onto a vehicle. But my personal favorite of all the slip base systems has got to be the angled slip base. And this was, in fact, my first introduction to slip bases, when somebody sent me this photo on the left. And in the photo, you can see one base that has a sign, one that doesn't have a sign. I'm not sure if it got knocked off or if they just haven't installed it yet. But you can see the impact of this on the right. So in that animation, the sign flips up and over and lands behind the vehicle. And that's the idea behind the angled slip base, is that because of the angle, the sign launches upward and you pass safely underneath it. Of course, it assumes a direction of impact, so it doesn't work everywhere. If you're not sure which direction the vehicle will be coming from, you can't really use an angled slip base. But where they work, I think they're quite clever solutions. Now, why am I talking about these? Aside from them just being neat and everywhere, I think that there's a lesson in these about where design problems get solved. So in this case, we're talking about making cars safer. But the solution isn't totally limited to the car itself, right? It's the things around it. It's the adjacencies. So when thinking about a design problem, it's helpful to sometimes broaden your scope a bit and think not just about, the object being designed, but the things around that object and how they are going to be affected. And sometimes the solution isn't exactly where the problem would lead you to think it is. And on that note, I will just let this clip run one more time because I absolutely love it, and then move on to the next thing. I think it's safe to say that if you've driven around much in this country, you've seen one of these before, and you probably even know what it is. It looks like a tree, sort of, but it's really a cell tower. And this tradition of camouflaging cell towers as trees and other things goes back decades. Now, it's not what the people at Bell Labs were thinking of when they first came up with this idea of a cellular network, which was a biological idea, right? But I don't think they meant it to be taken quite so literally in this way. But needless to say, this has been a phenomenon for quite some time. And these trees take many different forms. Often they're designed to fit into different particular landscapes. And the reason that they exist at all can be largely chalked up to municipalities wanting to camouflage these cell towers that they had to have. So they might not be able to control whether or not they have a tower, but they can exercise some control over what it looks like and say, for example, we want it to be camouflaged. And one of the ways of doing that is to use trees. And as you can see again from the pictures, some of these are a little more effective than others. Some stand out more than others, in part because they need to reach high or because of what the other surrounding greenery looks like. And one of the companies that really kind of pioneered this is a company called Larson. And they had already worked on a number of faux landscape designs for museums and zoos. So they knew how to build lifelike trees, and were positioned well when the legislation rolled around that allowed municipalities to have a bit more control over the design of towers in their areas. This company was ready to start rolling out those kinds of towers, and they came up with all these different models you see along the top of the screen, including mono palms and mono elms and even cacti that are actually pretty effectively camouflaged. On the bottom, what you see are a number of other camouflage strategies that have been used. Often, church towers are located towards the tops of towns, so they become a kind of easy place to disguise a cell tower or old unused water towers. So if you look around, you'll start to see cell tower infrastructure in more places than you might expect. Now, there are some issues. For one thing, it costs a lot of money to camouflage a cell tower. One estimate I read put it at around $100,000. And partly that's because you're adding a bunch of stuff. And partly it's because adding that bunch of stuff makes the whole system weigh more. So that means you need more structure to support all of that stuff. And in the end, sometimes you get results like on the lower left where you have this kind of spindly thing sticking up really high, so it has good signal, and maybe maybe they kind of skimped on branches because each branch adds weight and cost, so it doesn't look quite as tree-like anyway. And I'm not against this approach per se, but I will say there is something beautiful about the simple functional expression of a tower doing what it was designed to do. And if there's a larger lesson here, I think it's this: push back on clients when you feel the need to. It's always a difficult balance because people will come to you with design problems. People you're working for, either clients or bosses, and they will have a vision for how to solve that problem. So sometimes it takes doing a little bit of research and finding some examples and saying, perhaps the best thing in this situation is a simpler thing. And in this case, in particular, if municipalities could be convinced that a minimalist tower is okay, they would also be able to save a lot of money. So, given that I have a master's in architecture, I would be remiss not to dive in a bit more on this subject. And I wanted to pull in some illustrations as well from our book by Patrick Vale, who does kind of an amazing array of work when it comes to built environments, drawing everything from buildings to cityscapes. And I also want to pull something out of the architecture chapter that I think sounds boring, but is actually potentially the most interesting part because it has such wide-ranging impacts for design, and that is regulations. So, a lot of the built environment is subtly shaped by rules and taxes. And for example, on the left, you have a series of row homes in Amsterdam. And it turns out that these skinny, cute Dutch buildings that define the cityscape weren't made that way for aesthetic reasons. They were there because people were being taxed on frontage. So they minimized frontage in order to pay less taxes. And this had some side effects, like you can see this piece of furniture being hoisted up. It's going to go into that window because the staircases are so narrow in these buildings, they can't actually move big objects up and down. So for businesses, especially that were moving and shipping things, these hoists were historically essential, and a lot of them are still around. But when you go to the city, you'd never think, oh, well, this is all because of taxes. You think, wow, it's just a beautiful city. But it's amazing how it can trace back to this one little thing. And there are other sort of subtle examples of this too. Like in the middle of the page, you can see a building that's from Glasgow. In fact, I walked by this years ago when I was there, and the windows are bricked up. Why? Because at one point they implemented a window tax, and the idea was this would be a progressive tax. People with big mansions would pay more because they had a lot more windows. Of course, it didn't always work out that way, and some people, skirted the system by breaking up their windows. And then some people just left them that way because it was, just a matter of inertia. So to this day, you can see this is like a byproduct of a really old tax that has long since been repealed. But finally, on the right, we have mansard roofs. Now, this is something that is not location specific, although Paris, France is definitely the most well-known place for this roof style. How did these come about? Well, essentially, they set a height on buildings. And this height limit went up to the cornice line. And so people got creative and built up these roofs higher than the rest of the buildings and, used as much of that space as possible. And it became a style. So this thing that, again, we think of as an aesthetic choice was really driven by the constraints and the cleverness of people living at a certain time and place that has since gone on to, become an aesthetic around the world. And coming back to the United States, New York City is historically the home of a lot of zoning rules and regulations, which have had a lot of positive and negative effects on cities, which I won't go too far into, but I just wanted to show a couple of examples. One is that there's this thing that they have where you can exchange the right to build up your building with another developer. So for example, if you have a church and you don't want to build anything else on that lot, you can sell the rights to build higher to another building. Now, this helps the city maintain a kind of target density, but it also helps with historic preservation. So, for example, Broadway really benefited from this kind of regulation because these low-rise Broadway theaters were able to sell off their air rights, knowing they wouldn't want to build higher, which in turn allows New York to have this kind of rich diversity of tall buildings and shorter buildings. In the middle, you have a phenomenon called Manhattan Hinge, which is when the sun lines up with all the blocks, which is just kind of a neat thing. We go into that in the book. And on the right, I won't go into too much detail about the story, but I just wanted to bring that image in because it illustrates setbacks. And so when you see a building rising up and then stepping back from the street and then rising up and stepping back some more, often that's a product of a rule or a regulation that says you can only build high if you also step back from the street. And there are multiple reasons for rules like this that have to do with view corridors and casting shadows. But when you see buildings that don't have that, tall buildings that don't have that, you can kind of date them in New York City. You can say, oh, well, that building was built before they mandated setbacks, obviously. And the experience of them is much different because you face this huge wall that can rise really high up from the street. So just in terms of thinking about like how constraints inform design, it's really important to realize that even things that seem unconstrained or seem aesthetically driven are often the products of particular times, places, and just these tiny and sometimes arbitrary rules that form the kind of envelope in which we can create. So this is a design you've probably seen before. It's this trapezoidal retroreflective stud that is often placed in the middle of lanes or on the sides of roads. It makes a little bump when you go over it to let you know you're crossing over, and it reflects light back from your headlights so that you can see it at night and see where you're going. Pretty nifty all around. And there are variations on this design too. Like there's different colors for like police pull-off points and fire hydrants and utilities that are all color-coded, and those are all great. But the specific design I want to talk about kind of captures, I feel like, so many aspects of the design process and things that can go right and things that can go wrong. And it starts out one night with a man named Percy Shaw driving down the road near Halifax on the way back home from his favorite pub when he spots a set of cat's eyes reflected in his headlights. And he credits that cat with, saving his life. He would have gone off the road if the cat hadn't been sitting on the edge of the road. It was foggy, you couldn't see where he's going. And so he has this moment of inspiration where he thinks, well, this is a problem, and maybe I can do something about it. So why did he think he could do something about it? Well, he was a tinkerer, but he was also a paver. So he had experience with roads, and as he began to try out different designs and iterate on his designs, he tested them in the world by illegally putting them into the pavement on rural roads near his home. So again, a classic kind of design maneuver, right? You design, you test, you iterate, and you take advantage of skills you already have and a problem that needs to be solved. So what was his solution? His solution, well, it's called cat's eyes. And these devices are surprisingly sophisticated. I mean, these trapezoids we've got here in the US are kind of simple by comparison. Basically, there's two glass beads embedded into that center portion you see, the sort of main housing. And there are a few other tricks to it too. Like, for example, in later versions that he made, there were little rubber wipers underneath the surface of the road. And the idea was when somebody drove over this and pushed it down with their car, when it's raining, those wipers, those rubber wipers would wipe off the glass and clean it. So it's this sort of self-cleaning, retroreflective device. But then Percy ran into another classic design problem, which was finding people to buy it. It turned out that cities weren't especially interested, at least not at the outset. And what it took was World War II, essentially, to get the government interested in buying a lot of them. Because during World War II, they had to black out the country at times in order to avoid detection by overhead German bombers. So to kind of minimize light, among other things, they turn off street lighting and have people dim the lights on their cars. And so it was more important than ever that people have some way to find their way down roads at night, at times when the lights were off. And so suddenly, he gets an invitation to Whitehall, and he gets this amazing, client and contract, and he starts deploying tens of thousands of these things. And some of them make it out of the UK too, and around the world. And he did some traveling and selling of these. But eventually he just ended up back in Halifax. It was where he grew up, where he wanted to be. And, the, the kind of epilogue piece that I always love is just that people would kind of see him, and he's living in a pretty normal looking house, living a pretty normal life. The only real difference was that he now was driving up those same highways that he had driven along when he first kind of had this aha moment in a really fancy Rolls Royce that he bought with the proceeds of his invention. Now, there are a lot of lessons you could take from this, but I do think that a really important one is being open to identifying problems, and especially trying to figure out ways in which your skill set can apply to solving those problems, or finding people whose skill set does. So, design is a kind of problem solving industry, and whether you're working for a boss or working for clients or doing something entrepreneurial, keep your eyes open for problems that you think you can solve and ways you think you could solve them. So I've been thinking about the problems of hostile architecture and defensive design for years now, and it really kind of came to a head when I picked up a copy of this book, Unpleasant Design, and boy, is it an unpleasantly designed book, to the point where the flap is actually made of sandpaper and ground down my laptop a bit, and I put it in the same bag. So it really embodies what it's about, which is unpleasant design. Now, it covers a lot of things that are in public spaces in particular, things like on the upper right, blue lighting, which is designed so that heroin users won't be able to see their veins and thus won't be able to inject drugs. And pink light below that, which is designed to highlight blemishes on the faces of teenagers. So the idea is to discourage a particular demographic from congregating in particular space. So what we're talking about broadly here is dissuasive designs that are made to keep you from doing something. And they're not anything new, and some of them are really obvious, including things like spikes. When you see spikes, you know what they're there for. They're there to discourage you from sitting or lying down. And they're a common feature in a lot of cities, but there are much older examples too. Even something as seemingly innocuous as lights has been a subject of contention in the past. And as they go into in the book, hundreds of years ago, people were smashing lights because they either wanted to get away with illegal stuff or they wanted to start revolutions, which arguably is illegal, but maybe for the greater good. So even something that can seem like a public service, like a streetlight, can be a nuisance design to certain other people. These days, things like you see below, like leaning benches, are a pretty common way of keeping people from spending too much time in one place. They offer some support while you kind of stand and lean against them, wait for the bus maybe. But as you can see from the guy on the lower right, they're definitely not made for lying down on. But probably the most impressive of all of these, if that's the word for it, is the Camden bench. It's been called the ultimate anti-object. It is hard to skate. It's hard to graffiti because of the material used. There's like a space to like put your bag behind your legs so that you don't get your bag stolen. There's no place, however, to like stash your drugs if you're a dealer. And it's technically sittable, so it's not. I mean, it doesn't look like a great place to sit, but it works as a bench. And the authors of Unpleasant Design would argue that it's very successful as a design. Now, it might sound strange because you might want to do some of those activities or might think that they're okay, but their kind of overarching thesis is that we have to judge designs based on their success with respect to what their goals are, and if the goal is to dissuade people from doing anything, well, this bench does a decent job of that. But where things get tricky, at least in my opinion, is when it comes to dissuasive designs that are not completely obvious. So on the left, we have some boulders in the Bay Area, and those landscaping elements are really not there to look nice. I mean, they also don't really look nice, but they're there to stop people from setting up tents. And on the right, we have an example of a bike rack, and there's this kind of famous case in Seattle, or at least famous in the urbanist world, where it turned out a bike rack that was put in a kind of strange place was there because the city wanted to dissuade homeless people from camping there. And of course, there are a lot of potential issues with this, including the fact that these kinds of designs often just kind of move people around and often move people to less safe areas. So one can really get into a long debate about the ethics of and efficacy of these kinds of designs. Or one can take up arms and fight back. So there's this guy who puts these design crime stickers on things that he identifies as hostile architecture. In this case, it's an armrest, which you might not think is hostile, but a lot of armrests are designed to keep people from lying down on benches. And then in the upper right, we have a woman who's an artist, and in this project, she created these suits that were each custom designed to kind of overcome a hostile design. And what I love about it is that in a single image, you see exactly what she's reacting to, and it makes you hyper aware of what that object was designed to do, which is to keep you from lying down. So to do that, she has to wear this elaborate suit, effectively. So whether or not you agree with the statement, it kind of gives you an idea of what's actually going on there and what that thing was designed to do. And then in the lower right, we have a seat that somebody attached to a piece of scaffolding, and it's part of a larger project of deploying seating in areas that there's a perceived need for seating in cities. So that's a kind of constructive approach to resolving a perceived problem. Now, one can really go into this, and I have, and we did in the book, but the real point I'm trying to make here is about awareness and observation. It's really important to understand communities you're designing for, whether or not that's a public community or a private, user, consumer, and to understand who might be excluded by a certain design. And a kind of classic example of this is left-handed people are often have to struggle with designs made for right-handed people, and it's maybe something that as a right-handed person you've never thought about, but left-handed people have. And so my takeaway here is just do your research. Look into who's going to be impacted in what ways by the designs you're doing, whether they're industrial, graphic, architectural, urban. You can never understand the context well enough. So always try to understand more before you launch into a design. So in writing this book and designing it and considering what would go where, this story almost didn't make it until we figured out it made perfect sense as a way to end a chapter on architecture, because it addresses something that all designs face at some point in their lifetime, which is the end of their usefulness. But to put it in context, let me start here. This shrine has been rebuilt every 20 years for over a millennium. It's a kind of historic preservation in real time and ongoing. Every time they rebuild it exactly as it was the last time, but that keeps it from decaying. And it speaks to Shinto beliefs about death and renewal, but it's also a way of keeping this building alive. And in Japan, more broadly, there is this understanding that buildings won't last forever. They are no strangers to tsunamis and earthquakes, and the damage that those wreak, sometimes collapsing buildings or sometimes just making them structurally unsafe to occupy. And so buildings have a turnover, and the Japanese recognize this. And their building codes have evolved over the years to make more durable structures, but there is still a need to take buildings down. But when they do that, they have some amazingly graceful methods for doing so. So, for example, instead of just dynamiting a building, which causes a lot of, secondary effects, they carefully dismantle many buildings one floor at a time. So this particular structure was unbuilt using the Tasei ecological reproduction system. So basically they start by enclosing the top floor and then unbuild one floor at a time and lower this cap as they do. And so there's a ceiling crane inside of this top cap, and it helps them like take things apart and lower stuff down. And they even use the kinetic energy generated by the lowering of stuff to help power their operations on site. So it's pretty ingenious, and it's much quieter than other, deconstruction or demolition methods. It's much cleaner, and it helps them organize materials for recycling better too. But wildly enough, this isn't the only kind of deconstruction that they engage in. They also do something that is called the cut and takedown method, which was pioneered by the Kahima Corporation, and it involves dismantling buildings at the ground level by slowly propping up the floors, taking each floor apart, then lowering the whole building down. And it turns out that by doing that, you can much better organize materials in the ground. You've got more space to work with. There's no kind of lowering of stuff. And so they can batch stuff up and recycle more effectively, and it actually works out amazingly enough. So more broadly, in Japan, there's this awareness of how short-termism can be wasteful, and there are efforts to avoid making structures that won't be durable. And there's lots of really creative techniques, like certain kinds of wood joinery they use to help make buildings a little bit flexible during earthquakes. But nonetheless, every building has an end, and these techniques might have been born somewhat out of regional circumstances, but they are applicable everywhere, and they embody this kind of fundamental truth about the nature of human constructions around the world, which is that no building lasts forever. Now, there's a lot to criticize about the global culture of planned obsolescence, but even well-built things eventually become obsolete. So, in light of that, it's worth being deliberate and considerate about how long your design is going to last and what's going to happen to it when its effective lifespan is over. Now, if all has gone well, you've just seen this entire presentation, but I don't know for sure because I'm pre-recording this message. So hopefully we're all still here and the internet's working, and I'm ready to jump in and take your questions. Here we go. Technology. So yeah, it's funny that story really did almost get cut, and I fought hard for some stories, and that one, it just felt like the perfect ending, and so it also felt like a good one to end this presentation on, too.
Very cool. Thank you very much, Kurt.